to introduce to you today Christopher Ferrara. He's the President and Chief Counsel of the American Catholic Lawyers Association, which is located in New Jersey. He's a regular contributor to the Latin Mass magazine, and he's the author of several books. A couple of his books in the back are available for purchase. And so he's been done very great work defending Catholics who are in trouble with the law on pro-abortion questions and anything along like that. So the title of his talk is going to be Liberty and the God That Failed. So where's Chris? Chris.
Thank you, Father. I guess the précis for this talk is a short case for a modern reconstruction of Christendom as the only answer to the civilizational crisis. A modest task, indeed. And I have about 45 to 50 minutes, so I'll make some remarks, and it's based upon this book that I've finished, which is now in the hands of an editor. And I think one of the things that might be worthwhile about the book is that I address this accusation against Catholics of special pleading. That we look back at history, we take out certain facts that are inconvenient, we insert the Catholic facts, and then we say, see, our arguments about what happened in modernity are correct, and we're accused of special pleading. Well, today I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the discoveries I made in the course of researching this book, on the basis of which we can make our case entirely upon the basis of the statements of Protestants who advocated the social kingship of Christ. Protestants, who by our standards would be considered liberals, but by the standards of Protestantism are arch conservatives. So let me talk first of all about this idea of reconstructing Christendom. What is it we're reconstructing? We have lost sight of that. Karl Becker, in his famous lectures on the heavenly city of the Enlightenment philosophers, said it quite simply. He said what the philosophers of the Enlightenment did was to deconstruct the Christian story and its combination with Greek wisdom. In other words, the entire worldview of the medieval period. That's what distinguishes modernity from the medieval period. Our entire civilization has been shifted onto liberal foundations on the basis of the philosophy of the so-called moderate enlightenment. And I take the moderate enlightenment to task in my book and show that this so-called moderate enlightenment is a radical break with the medieval worldview. And Becker says that the medieval worldview is that man is created in the image of God, he fell from grace, and on account of this fall from grace is in need of redemption by a Redeemer, and through the redemption and the grace purchased for us by the redemption, man is perfected and is able to reassemble a civilization that reflects more what he is capable of in his original state of integrity. And this worldview, says Becker, is discarded. Original sin is out of the picture. We have man as he is and nature as it is as the basis of political society, and then the moderate enlightenment comes in and gives us the solution to our predicament, which certainly has nothing to do with Catholicism or revelation. We take man as he is, and religion is really basically good behavior. And if we can just get along with each other, then we will find a way to live together in the new order of things, which basically, as Pierre Menant has said, involves one simple thing: the emancipation of the body politic from the Catholic Church. Modernity is simply post-Catholic civilization, and the medieval worldview is the worldview of a Catholic civilization. Now, what struck me in reading this great work by Werner Jaeger, Paideia, the Greek concept of formation or education, is his discovery that what Plato was talking about in the life of the polis, in which religion is tightly integrated into the life of the state, what Plato was talking about, what he had prevision, was Catholic civilization. And this is what Werner Jaeger says in Volume 3 of his work. As long as we try to conceive of his educational system as a state, we feel it's strange and unnatural. But if we think of the greatest educational institution of the post-classical world, the Roman Catholic Church, it looks like a prophetic anticipation of many of the essential features of Catholicism. Then he goes on to say, the state built around Plato's central educational ideal moves from the republic to the laws nearer and nearer to the kingdom ruling over the souls of men, which the church later brought into being. This is a Harvard scholar of classical antiquity, seeing in Plato what the church has seen, the seeds of the word in anticipation of Catholic civilization. And all of that has been destroyed. And as I said, we've seen our civilization shifted onto liberal foundations. And these liberal foundations are presented to us as our great conservative inheritance. Listen to the talk radio. Listen to Rush Limbaugh and the Sean Hannitys and all the rest of them. And they fight tooth and nail for what they call our conservative inheritance. And what is it? It's these principles. A social compact is the foundation of our state. Sovereignty rests in the consent of the governed and the sovereign will of the people. Government by the people. Church-state separation, of course, is the sine qua non, the non-interference of religion in politics, the confinement of religion to the realm of private opinions. You can believe anything you please as long as you agree that at the level of the public it is absolutely meaningless. The unlimited pursuit of gain, including the freedom to buy, to sell, or advertise anything you please. And total liberty of thought and action, both private and public. You have the right to your opinion, I have the right to my opinion. And basically a contractual society in which everything, including marriage, is a contract. And we've seen the results of that divorce culture. Now, Father Buckley mentioned that Our Lady of Fatima, looking at the modern world, coming to Fatima to give her prophecies about the course of modernity during the two great wars, predicted conditionally World War I ending and World War II being the next chastisement for sin. I want to take you back a little bit further to the Civil War in the United States of America, where we encounter these Protestants I was talking about. And what these Protestants could see, looking beyond the identities of these Enlightenment thinkers like Locke, who might seem very pious if you read his writings, they looked at the function of ideas. And this is a point that Peter Gay makes in his great history of the Enlightenment. We don't look at the origin of the ideas in particular thinkers. We look at their function. What do these ideas do when they're put into operation? And these Protestants at the time of the Civil War, in a movement called the National Reform Association, said that the ideas which were the foundation stones of political modernity had brought about the chastisement of America, and that the Civil War was a chastisement of America. And the National Reform Association assembled to address this crisis in America. And the things that it said could have been written by any pope. They had conventions in various cities, Pittsburgh being one of them. And at their 1874 convention, the Reverend Horace Bushnell, in July, actually quoting a sermon by Reverend Horace Bushnell in July of 1861, right at the start of the Civil War, at the 1874 convention, they quoted this sermon, and Bushnell took aim at the idea of society as a social compact. He said, it is a remarkable but very serious fact that our grand revolutionary fathers left us the legacy of this war, meaning the Civil War, which was just then beginning, in the ambiguities of thought and principle which they suffered in respect of the foundations of government. Proximately, our whole difficulty is an issue forced by slavery. But if we go back to the deepest root of the trouble, we shall find that it comes by trying to maintain a government without moral ideas and concentrate a loyal feeling around institutions that, as many reason, are only human compacts. And so the NRA, the National Reform Association, lamented in its proceedings what it considered to be the source of this problem in America's organic law, the Constitution. And they cite such things as the famous encounter between Alexander Hamilton and the theologian Dr. John Rogers, who was the chaplain of the Revolution, following the adjournment of the Constitutional Convention. And he said to Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Hamilton, we are greatly grieved that the Constitution has no recognition of God or the Christian religion. And Hamilton replied, I declare, we forgot it. Now, the NRA cited another telling incident in the early history of the Republic. And these are Protestants commenting on the Republic, not special pleading Catholics. They cited the Treaty of Tripoli, which was designed to eliminate our problems with the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. The Treaty of Tripoli was approved by President John Adams in 1797, the very dawn of the Republic. And the Treaty of Tripoli provides, in one of its articles, and I quote, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of the Mussulmen, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. And that was only the third unanimous vote, the adoption of this treaty, in the Senate's history, and there were 339 votes taken up to that point. And here's this movement of Protestants at the time of the Civil War, citing this treaty as a sign that we have a serious problem in this country. And they also cited Thomas Jefferson's refusal even to engage in a day of prayer and fasting during a time of national crisis. And the NRA said this in one of its resolutions: resolved that it is a striking and solemn fact that our present national constitution is so devoid of any Christian feature that one of our chief magistrates, meaning Jefferson, once refused to appoint a day of fasting and prayer in an hour of public calamity, because the nation in its constitution recognized no God. And another, meaning John Adams, with the Treaty of Tripoli, and contracting a treaty with the Mohammedan power, hesitated not to declare that the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. And the NRA declared that these incidents and others like them had caused the people of the United States to awaken, and I'm quoting, to the fact that the national constitution is destitute of any explicit acknowledgement of God or the Christian religion. Although it is the fundamental law of a great Christian people, its want of a distinct Christian character has led even such men as Dr. Wolseley, ex-president of Yale College, to state that it would need no change to adapt it to a Mohammedan nation. Now, their complaint was essentially not merely that the Constitution was godless, but that it was Christless, specifically Christless. For example, in one of the sermons quoted in the Proceedings of the NRA in 1874, a sermon by James R. Wilson, Wilson said this: there was not only in the theory of our government no recognition of God's laws and sovereignty, but its practical operation, its administration has been conformable to its theory. Those who have been called to administer the government have not been making any profession of Christianity. Washington was a man of valor and wisdom. He was esteemed by the whole world as a good and great man, but he was not a professing Christian. Now that was political heresy, to say that the sainted Washington was not a Christian. But many people have exposed this truth of history, including David Holmes in his study of the faith of the Founding Fathers. And he essentially goes through the first 5 presidents and shows that every single one of them was a deist. And deism, of course, was reaching its apogee in the late Enlightenment. In the 1770s, it was a rival to Christianity among the educated. And the founders were basically deists, and the National Reform Association recognized that the leading founders were by and large deistic. And what was the solution to the problem of the Constitution? They proposed a Christian amendment to the Constitution. And the amendment would read as follows: we, the people of the United States, humbly acknowledging Almighty God as the source of all authority and power in civil government, the Lord Jesus Christ as the ruler among the nations, His revealed will as the supreme law of the land, in order to constitute a Christian government, and in order to form a more perfect union, etc. It's a specific invocation of the kingship of Christ by a group of Protestants in the 1870s. Now, I uncovered something else in my research. In the Confederacy, there was an analog to this movement for a Christian constitution, and it was led by a Protestant evangelical minister of the Presbyterian persuasion named James Henley Thornwell. And Henley said to the Confederate Congress, who had a constitution that was substantially identical to the United States Constitution. Study the 2 documents, they're practically verbatim replicas. He said to the Confederate Congress in a paper he delivered at a religious congress, look, our Constitution is a step in the right direction. We have a generic acknowledgement of divinity, but our Constitution is not Christian. So he proposed the Confederate version of a Christian amendment to the Constitution. We, the people of these Confederate states, distinctly acknowledge our responsibility to God and the supremacy of His Son, Jesus Christ, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and hereby ordain that no law shall be passed by the Congress of these Confederate states inconsistent with the will of God as revealed in the Holy Scriptures. Protestants were advocating this in both the Confederacy and the Union during and after the Civil War, although Thornwell's version of the movement in the Confederacy died with him. But the Union version, the Northern version, the National Reform Association, went on for decades, and they got nowhere. Let me give you some examples of what they said. J.R. Sloan, in the 1872 convention proceedings, gave an address, actually was quoted from the New York Times back in May of 1863, an editorial. Now, Sloan was a nationally prominent Presbyterian minister and theologian, and he specifically condemned the Constitution's explicit protection of the institution of slavery, and he said, "We have disobeyed and dishonored God. We have no recognition of His name or authority in the Constitution of the United States." He went on to say that if the Constitution were lost and dug up by an archaeologist 1,000 years from now, quote, "no mortal will be able to tell whether it was the Constitution of a Christian or a pagan land from any word or sentence found in it." Of course, that's the same problem we have with the EU Constitution. Only this was the Constitution of the United States, the organic law of this country, and it wasn't a Catholic who was protesting this problem, it was a Presbyterian. So let's hear no more about Catholic special pleading on this question. Now these Protestants referred to this defect in the Constitution, and let me insert a caveat. Of course, we can take an oath to the Constitution. Catholics respect duly constituted governments. Catholics lived peaceably even under pagan emperors. They even marched in the armies of pagan emperors. The issue is not whether we respect this government, but whether we can see that it has deficiencies, as this movement did. So we pledge allegiance to it. We swear an oath to the Constitution, recognizing its deficiencies. So let's get that caveat out of the way. Nevertheless, this movement spoke of the original sin of the nation. That was a theme in their proceedings. They called it, and I quote, the original sin of the nation, that it neglected God and Christ and the Constitution. And they presented a chain of testimonies going all the way back to the very beginning of the Republic. For example, in 1788, Luther Martin, the delegate from Maryland to the Constitutional Convention, ridiculed the failure to mention God with this sarcastic remark. There were some members so unfashionable to think that a belief in the existence of a deity would be some security for the good conduct of our rulers, and that in a Christian country it would be at least decent to hold out some distinction between the professors of Christianity and downright infidelity or paganism. That was his problem with the Constitution. Now, in 1793, John M. Mason, one of the great pulpit orators of the Revolutionary era, said this about the Constitution. 1793. That very Constitution, which the singular goodness of God enabled us to establish, does not even recognize His being. He called that a shameful truth that should crimson our faces. He went on to say that the federal Constitution makes no acknowledgement of God that gave us our national existence and saved us from internal anarchy and war. And Mason opposed the presidential candidacy of none other than Thomas Jefferson, because Mason said Jefferson was an infidel, which by any objective standard of Christianity, he obviously was. And he said that if we were to elect, quote, such an infidel as Mr. Jefferson to the presidency, quote, you will declare by a solemn national act that there is no more religion in your collective character than in your written constitution. You will put a national indignity upon the God of your mercies and provoke Him. It may be to send over your land that deluge of judgments which His forbearance has hitherto suspended. And other Protestants were making prophecies along these lines, and the War of 1812 happened shortly thereafter with the sacking of Washington and the burning of the White House, and the Civil War thereafter. Now, in 1812, another spokesman is quoted by these proceedings, the Honorable Samuel Taggart, a former U.S. congressman. And he said, quote, perhaps there is no one feature in the Constitution of the United States which has been the subject of more numerous encomiums or more unqualified praise than this, that it takes no notice of and is not at all connected with religion. In this instance, he said, the United States are exhibiting a new and singular spectacle to the world, a phenomenon which the world has never witnessed before. It is a bold experiment, and one which I fear can only issue in national apostasy and ruin. 1811. And there are many other testimonies along these lines, but I think that one of them is perhaps the most telling of all. It's an editorial in a newspaper that was conservative during the Civil War, but made a liberal turn afterwards. And that editorial reads as follows. This is in the New York Independent of September 26, 1861, right at the start of the Civil War. A New York newspaper published by Protestants. To sum up the iniquity of this nation in one comprehensive charge, it is godlessness. Not atheism in the philosophical sense of denying the existence of God, but that practical atheism which ignores the law and the authority of God and the requirements of religion in both public and private affairs. This is long before the Warren Court got involved. This is not even at the time of the incorporation doctrine which applied the 14th Amendment to the states. This is 1861. We have shown, the editorial goes on to say, our godlessness as a nation by ignoring the name and authority of God in the framework of our political institutions. Neither the name of God nor any reference to His law, His government, or His providence can be found in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution has nothing to do with religion except as a barrier between it and the state. Now, you hear conservatives today talk about the articles of peace that the Constitution represents and how it guarantees freedom for all religions on a religiously neutral basis. But these Protestants could see that, in effect, the Constitution was a barrier between the state and religion. And the Supreme Court really developed the implications of that principle of our organic law and the subsequent decisions. But these Protestants were making predictions left and right, all of which came true. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Prophecy after prophecy. Dr. Sloan, speaking at the convention, said, "The enemy gains, and the Christian sentiment is overbalanced by a contemptible minority of people because in an unfortunate hour they accepted a constitution which has no clause recognizing the great moral power which has made and preserves the nation." The theologian Taylor Lewis said that America's, quote, perilous experiment of ignoring a divine ruler has been tried, and its failure is rapidly developing itself. God will allow no such silence, much less any profession of indifference. The word of Christ shall show itself to be true. He that is not for me is against me. He that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad. And the NRA's General Secretary, at one of its conventions, predicted the following: the written Constitution must be amended to conform to the facts as they have actually been evolved. If this is not done, the Constitution will, in time, conform everything to itself. The facts, the usages, the legislative and judicial actions, everything, in a word, that is out of harmony with the written instrument will give way before its molding and controlling influence and disappear. And Professor Blanchard delivered a paper called The Conflict of Law at the 1874 convention. Again, before the Supreme Court incorporated the Constitution and the Bill of Rights into state constitutions by the incorporation doctrine, before the Constitution was formally imposed upon the states, these people were predicting that the gravitational influence of the document would cause states to imitate it and amend their constitutions, laws, and institutions in imitation of the federal Constitution. So Blanchard said that he was certain that no state law favorable to Christianity can stand a suit in the Supreme Court of the United States. This conflict of law is inevitable and irrepressible. Our laws will be heathenized or our Constitution Christianized. And he said Americans must soon decide which they will have done. And this was at a time when in Barron versus Baltimore and United States versus Cruikshank, the Supreme Court was still refusing to apply the Constitution formally to the United States of America. Now, one address that was very interesting was by a theologian named T.P. Stevenson. And he outlines a scenario of how the Constitution was achieving this secularization of America, because it was the organic law of the highest government in the nation exerting this gravitational pull on the states. He gives this scenario. A German secularist lands on our shores. The American Constitution is held out to him as the fundamental bond of our political union. He finds in it no recognition of God, in whom he does not believe, or of a law whose authority he denies. He assents to it and becomes a citizen. A school tax is levied on his property. He pays it and demands that the reading of the Bible cease in the schools. It was, he says, no part of the compact by which I became a citizen that I should be taxed to maintain public instruction in the Christian Scriptures. Now it may be said that in becoming a citizen, he accepted the Constitution of Ohio, and thus did become party to an acknowledgement of the Christian religion, because the Ohio Constitution at that time still acknowledged the Christian religion. But, said Stevenson, acknowledgments of God have not always been found in our state constitutions. If it is good for our national constitution to be devoid of religious character, why is it not good for the constitution of a state, of all states? And must not the national constitution exert a powerful and constant influence to draw the state constitutions to its own likeness in this respect? And so it did. Long before the Supreme Court began striking down remnants of Christian social order, the states had already obliged the Supreme Court by doing the same. So that basically, when these cases arrived at the Supreme Court, most of the states had already enacted religiously neutral legal regimes. And again, these people in the NRA conventions warned that unless something like the Christian Amendment were adopted, the Constitution would become a battering ram for the destruction of the remnants of Christian social order. The appeal of the enemy is to the Constitution, Stevenson said. The increasingly immoral ruling class of Chicago, said the attorney R.J. McNeese, quotes the United States Constitution as authority for such rebellion against the Almighty. The Reverend D. McAllister, General Secretary of the NRA, said that, and I quote, "the potent weapon with which they strive to smite down the religious observances and institutions of the country is the United States Constitution." And he said, "the enemies of our Christian institutions glory in the fact that the Constitution of the United States contains no acknowledgement of God or the Christian religion." And in the 1874 proceedings, here is the assessment of what will finally happen. And I'm quoting, "It is a serious matter if the Constitution should be found wanting in any principle or any matter of fact. The deficiency will in due time work mischief. Error in the Constitution will work as powerfully as truth. And what is left out may one day be formally declared un-American." And that's exactly what has happened. It's un-American now, even to breathe a word of this idea that the government of the United States should explicitly acknowledge the kingship of Christ. It's considered lunacy. Even for saying this today, I might find myself subjected to a battery of multiphasic personality tests, like Dr. Connolly. And then the NRA said, look, the liberals are making these non-negotiable demands. And if we don't do something, the liberals are going to get these demands fulfilled. Here are two of the demands that the liberals were making in 1874. "We demand that all laws looking to the enforcement of Christian morality shall be abrogated, and that all laws shall be conformed to the requirements of natural morality, equal rights, and impartial liberty. Next demand, we demand that not only in the Constitution of the United States and in the several states, but also in the practical administration of the same, no privilege or advantage shall be conceded to Christianity or any other special religion, that our entire political system shall be founded and administered on a purely secular basis." Mission accomplished. Now, I show in the book that ultimately this NRA movement succumbed to the incoherence of the Protestant religion. When Hobbes wrote his magnum opus, Leviathan, in the final chapter, he says, "The reason I wrote this great work of mine was to exercise, or be sure that the spirit of Rome as he called it, continued to be exorcised from the Europe in which he wrote, post-Reformation Europe. He wanted to be sure to maintain the exorcism of the spirit of Rome. And the exorcism of the spirit of Rome means, as I said at the beginning of the talk, the emancipation of the body politic from the Catholic Church, separation of the church and state, the destruction of this whole idea of a confessional state, which leaves the individual defenseless before power. And as Father said in his talk, when power is not restrained by God, it becomes diabolical. And the theme of my book is that liberty is just another word for power. Power of a kind that we have never seen before. Power unrestrained by the divine law and even by the natural law now. So the NRA had this problem. It wanted a Christian republic, but it also agreed with Hobbes, Locke, and the entire Enlightenment that there must be a separation of church and state. Well, then how do you maintain a Christian republic? How do you maintain the moral fiber of a people without some kind of organic relationship between an ultimate authority to define matters of faith and morals and settle disputes over morality? They had no answer. They were accused of advocating discrimination with their Christian amendment. And here's their answer to the charge of discrimination. The people of the United States will protect the rights of every citizen and persecute no man for his religion until that religion drives him to disobey the law which expresses the will of the majority concerning the moral duty of the citizen. And that will is always open to revision by constitutional means. So here's this noble movement of Protestants calling for a Christian commonwealth extinguishing its own position during its own convention. And Orestes Brownson, writing in 1845, just after his conversion, picked up on this problem. He said, look, we all agree we need a religious principle, but it sure isn't going to come from the Protestant religion, because the Protestant religion is subject to majority sentiment. And he said, and I quote, the holding of slaves is compatible with Christian character south of a geographical line, and incompatible north, and Christian morals change according to the prejudices, interests, or habits of the people, as evidenced by the recent divisions between the Baptists and the Methodists. The Unitarians of Savannah refuse to hear a preacher accredited by the Unitarians of Boston. And on he goes. He says, we need a religion, obviously, to secure a democratic republic. And it has to be the Catholic religion, because that is the only religion that is not subject to the democratic process, which is inherent in Protestantism with its principle of private judgment. But then the Protestants say, aha, you wish to subject religion to the Pope. and Brownson, being the brilliant polemicist he was, says, thank you for proving my argument. He says, this is good proof of our position, that Protestantism cannot govern the people, for they govern it. The Roman Catholic religion, then, he said, is necessary to sustain popular liberty, because popular liberty can be sustained only by a religion free from popular control. Duh! and this has been the problem of political modernity, because we had a religious revolution in the 16th century, applying the principle of Protestant judgment to religion, and then during about 80 to 90 years later, we had the philosophical Reformation, applying the principle of private judgment to philosophy, and the entire foundation of our civilization collapsed, beginning with Locke and his epistemological questions, which basically undermined our belief in the certitude of everything in his so-called essay concerning human understanding. So even though their prescription imploded on itself, we can at least give them credit for recognizing a problem that Catholics have always recognized. And unfortunately for the movement, the 43rd Congress of the United States rejected their Christian amendment and said, and I quote, the fathers of the Republic in the convention which framed the Constitution decided that this country, the foundations of whose government they were laying, was to be the home of the oppressed of all nations, whether Christian or pagan, and decided with great unanimity that it was inexpedient to put anything into the Constitution or frame of government which might be construed to be a reference to any religious creed or doctrine, amendment tabled. And they tried 3 more times to get it passed, and they failed. And eventually the movement went out of existence. Now, that's the pessimism in my speech. Father said he's an optimist. So am I. I'll give you about 5 or 10 minutes of optimism. Do I have 5 or 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. there are some signs of hope. And the hope proceeds from one simple truth. The Word has power. The Word incarnate has power. We need to only speak it to see it begin to change things. And so we have seen some signs of a reversal. Let me give you one that you may have heard about. Nicaragua in 2008 repealed a century-old law that permitted abortion in certain cases and abolished abortion completely. No exceptions whatsoever. And the leader of that movement was none other than Daniel Ortega.
You're kidding!
No. He came back to the church, he struck an alliance in their Nicaraguan parliament, and they got it passed. And the New York Times was horrified. Hopes among women's groups in Nicaragua have been dashed, said the Times. And that law is a throwback to the Middle Ages for women's rights. That old medieval period that modernity has surpassed. Now, in that same year, one Catholic commentator said something else was going on in Latin America. In Brazil, the commentator mentioned a seemingly miraculous transformation of the Brazilian hierarchy. They started a war, a polemical war against abortion, including graphic depictions of abortion procedures. And Brazilian lay Catholics, this commentator said, are horrified by what they see and are inspired to act against abortion. The bishop's goal, he said, is not only to stop new anti-life legislation, but to eliminate all exceptions in Brazil's penal code regarding abortion. Now, let's move away from Latin America. In April of this year, Hungary, which is about 60% Catholic, adopted a Christian constitution, very much like the National Reform Association in this country, consisting of Protestants, wanted in the 1860s. They adopted it in April of 2011. And that constitution was the result of a pan-Christian alliance involving Protestants, led by Viktor Orban, the Protestant head of Hungary's Fidesz party. And these Catholics and Protestants got together and passed a constitution that begins as follows. O Lord, blessed be the Hungarian nation. And there's a national avowal of faith in this constitution, passed only a few months ago, which reads as follows. We are proud that 1,000 years ago, our king, Saint Stephen, a canonized Catholic saint, based the Hungarian state on solid foundations and made our country a part of Christian Europe. This is what the EU would not even dare to mention. We acknowledge the role Christianity has played in preserving our nation. The Constitution also says human dignity shall be inviolable. Everyone shall have the right to life and human dignity. The life of the fetus shall be protected from the moment of conception. The same Constitution rejects gay marriage and defines the family as a conjugal union of a man and a woman based on their independent consent. Hungary shall also protect the institution of the family, which it recognizes as the basis for the survival of this nation. Now, of course, the whole world erupted in outrage over this. I could spend another 45 minutes just reading the terrified announcements in the press and on the internet. But here's one that strikes my fancy. Radio Netherlands credited with references to God, Christianity, the Holy Crown of Hungary, the fatherland, and traditional family values. Critics have slammed the new constitution as discriminatory. Against who? The devil? Another sign of hope. The EU has just come out with the equivalent of the Personhood Amendment that just failed in Mississippi. The Grand Chamber of the European Court of Justice, in a patent case of all cases, involving a geneticist who wanted to patent a technique for manipulating and destroying human embryos to correct genetic defects, sided with the patent office when it rejected his patent and said you can't experiment on embryos because they're human beings. The High Court of the EU, in a decision binding on all 27 member nations, said this: indeed, fertilization marks the beginning of the biological existence of a human being that undergoes a process of development. Therefore, the human embryo, at every stage of development, must be considered a human being with potential, not just a potential human being.
Yeah.
Now, that's It's almost miraculous. So I don't know what's happening in the EU. Maybe there's a conversion experience going on in the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Justice. I don't know. But the point is, we've been living with what Blake called mind-forged manacles. They're all in our head. Our civilization is in a kind of self-induced coma. We don't realize the power at our disposal. Even now, the overwhelming preponderance of the Western world is baptized Christians. And this commentator that I mentioned before about the Brazilian bishops and their miraculous transformation says, gee, what would happen if the bishops throughout the world did this kind of thing? In America, only 25% of the electorate is Catholic. But what if the bishops mobilized this electorate and got it to do what the people in Brazil are doing? Could any political party resist them? Of course not. No. All we need is the leadership. In my libertarian book, I have a scenario of the Supreme Court unfurling an opinion in which it says, Roe versus Wade is a distortion of our jurisprudence. It's contrary to our legal traditions. But you know what? It's also contrary to the law of God. We repeal it today in the name of God. And I say, what would happen? In my book, I explore the outcome of this thought experiment, this dream scenario. What would happen if the Catholic justices with life tenure actually wrote an opinion invoking the law of God as a ground for repealing Roe versus Wade? What would happen to them? Nothing. They have life tenure. The talk show hosts would be galvanized to support them, with the evangelical Protestants, maybe even some of the bishops would get behind the Supreme Court of the United States. It could be a defining moment. And I gave a talk on this theme somewhere else in Lake Garda, and I said, what is to prevent the Supreme Court majority from just doing this tomorrow? And when you think about it, nothing. It's a self-imposed tyranny. And the democratic process would actually be the means by which we could undo all of this. And the way we undo it through the democratic process is to change the organic law. You've got to get constitutional changes. Because then the caprice of the majority, it's very difficult from that point forward to undo what we've done once we've changed the organic law. So we need a human life amendment. We need changes in the organic law. But as Christopher Dawson said, and I'll wrap up with this remark, however secularized, and I'm quoting, our modern civilization has become, this sacred tradition remains like a river in the desert, and a genuine religious education can still use it to irrigate the thirsty lands, to change the face of the world with the promise of new life. And that education can only come from the church. And I said I would prove my case with Protestants. Here's what a Protestant says about how we make things right again in our society. D. Stephen Long, in his book, The Goodness of God. Beginning with the flesh of Jesus, he writes, and its presence in the church, theology alone can give due order to other social formations. Theology alone, he says. Family, market, and state. The goodness of God is discovered not in abstract speculation, but in a life oriented toward God that creates particular practices that require the privileging of certain social institutions above others. The goodness of God can be discovered only when the church is the social institution rendering intelligible our lives. And writing from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, H. Tristram Engelhardt says this, in the grip of Enlightenment dispositions regarding religion, few are inclined to recognize that the moral life, once disengaged from a culture of worship, loses its grasp on the moral premises that rightly direct our lives and foreclose the culture of death. And finally, the Anglican scholar John Milbank says it in one sentence, only a global liturgical polity can save us now from literal violence. And that global liturgical polity is nothing other than Christendom. We can get it back if we simply open our mouth to speak. And that's why the diagnosis is not terminal. A civilizational return to the social, political recognition of man's true nature and destiny is as near as the God who has endowed us with infinitely more than unalienable rights. Father said God is both near and far, and that is true. He has given us so much more than unalienable rights. A rational soul, an intellect governing our free wills, reason perfected by the supernatural gift of faith, the capacity for regeneration and grace, the law written on our hearts, the promise of life eternal. The divine dispensation Plato anticipated so many centuries ago in his quest for the good state that would foster the good man has always been ours for the asking. And the Latin motto is most pertinent here. Excita Domine potentiam tuam et veni ut salvos facias nos. Stir up your power, O Lord, and come that you may save us. We need only call upon the Word incarnate as one people, and then watch the world begin to change again. Thank you.